Who Rules the World? By Noam Chomsky. Chapter 8. The Week the World Stood Still. Chapter 9. The Oslo Accords, Their Context, Their Consequences. Chapter 10. The Eve of Destruction. Chapter 11. Israel-Palestine, The Real Options. Chapter 12. Nothing for Other People, Class War in the United States. Chapter 13. Whose Security? How Washington Protects Itself and the Corporate Sector. Chapter 14. Outrage. Chapter 15. How Many Minutes to Midnight? Chapter 16. Ceasefires in which violations never cease. 8. The Week the World Stood Still. The world stood still some 50 years ago during the last week of October, from the moment when it learned that the Soviet Union had placed nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba until the crisis was officially ended, though, unknown to the public, only officially. The image of the world standing still is the turn of phrase of Sheldon Stern, former historian at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, who published the authoritative version of the tapes of the meetings of the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm, in which Kennedy and a close circle of advisers debated how to respond to the crisis. Those meetings were secretly recorded by the President, which might bear on the fact that his stand throughout the recorded sessions is relatively temperate compared to those of other participants, who were unaware that they were speaking to history. Stern has now published an accessible and accurate review of this critically important documentary record, finally declassified in the late 1990s. I will keep to that version here. Never before or since, he concludes, has the survival of human civilization been at stake in a few short weeks of dangerous deliberations, culminating in the week the world stood still. There was good reason for the global concern. A nuclear war was all too imminent, a war that might destroy the Northern Hemisphere, as President Dwight Eisenhower had warned. Kennedy's own judgment was that the probability of war might have been as high as 50%. Estimates became higher as the confrontation reached its peak and the secret doomsday plan to ensure the survival of the government was put into effect in Washington, as described by journalist Michael Dobbs in his well-researched bestseller on the crisis, though he doesn't explain why there would be much point in doing so, given the likely nature of nuclear war. Dobbs quotes Dino Brugioni, a key member of the CIA team monitoring the Soviet missile buildup, who saw no way out except war and complete destruction as the clock moved to 1 minute to midnight. The title of Dobbs's book. 5 Kennedy's close associate, the historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. described the events as the most dangerous moment in human history. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara wondered aloud whether he would live to see another Saturday night, and later recognized that we lucked out, barely. The most dangerous moment. A closer look at what took place adds grim overtones to these judgments, with reverberations to the present moment. There are several candidates for the most dangerous moment. One is October 27, 1962, when U.S. destroyers enforcing a quarantine around Cuba were dropping depth charges on Soviet submarines. According to Soviet accounts, reported by the National Security Archive, submarine commanders were rattled enough to talk about firing nuclear torpedoes, whose 15-kiloton explosive yields approximated the bomb that devastated Hiroshima in August 1945. In one case, a reported decision to assemble a nuclear torpedo for battle readiness was aborted at the last minute by Second Captain Vasily Arkhipov, who may have saved the world from nuclear disaster. There is little doubt what the U.S. reaction would have been had the torpedo been fired, or how the Russians would have responded as their country was going up in smoke. Kennedy had already declared the highest nuclear alert short of launch, DEFCON 2, which authorized NATO aircraft with Turkish pilots or others to take off, fly to Moscow, and drop a bomb, according to the well-informed Harvard University strategic analyst Graham Allison, writing in Foreign Affairs. Another candidate is October 26th. That day has been selected as the most dangerous moment by B-52 pilot Major Don Clausen, who piloted one of those NATO aircraft and provides a hair-raising description of details of the Chrome Dome, CD, missions during the crisis, B-52s on airborne alert, with nuclear weapons, on board and ready to use. October 26th was the day when the nation was closest to nuclear war, he writes in his Irreverent Anecdotes of an Air Force Pilot. On that day, Clausen himself was in a good position to set off a likely terminal cataclysm. He concludes, "We were damned lucky we didn't blow up the world, and no thanks to the political or military leadership of this country. The errors, confusions, near accidents, and miscomprehension of the leadership that Clausen reports are startling enough, but nothing like the operative command and control rules, or lack of them." As Clausen recounts his experiences during the 15 24-hour CD missions he flew, the maximum possible, the official commanders did not possess the capability to prevent a rogue crew or crew member from arming and releasing their thermonuclear weapons, or even from broadcasting a mission that would have sent off the entire airborne alert force without possibility of recall. Once the crew was airborne carrying thermonuclear weapons, he writes, it would have been possible to arm and drop them all with no further input from the ground. There was no inhibitor on any of the systems. About 1/3 of the total force was in the air, according to General David Burchinal, Director of Plans on the Air Staff at Air Force Headquarters. The Strategic Air Command, SAC, technically in charge, appears to have had little control. And according to Clausen's account, the Civilian National Command Authority was kept in the dark by SAC, which means that the XCOM deciders, pondering the fate of the world, knew even less. General Burchinal's oral history is no less hair-raising, and reveals even greater contempt for the civilian command. According to him, Russian capitulation was never in doubt. The CD operations were designed to make it crystal clear to the Russians that they were hardly even competing in the military confrontation, and could quickly have been destroyed. From the XCOM records, Sheldon Stern concludes that, on October 26, President Kennedy was leaning towards military action to eliminate the missiles in Cuba, to be followed by invasion. According to Pentagon plans, it was evident then that the act might have led to terminal war, a conclusion fortified by much later revelations that tactical nuclear weapons had been deployed and that Russian forces were far greater than U.S. intelligence had reported. As the XCOM meetings were drawing to a close at 6 p.m. on the 26th, a letter arrived from Soviet Prime Minister Nikita Khrushchev, sent directly to President Kennedy. His message seemed clear, Stern writes. The missiles would be removed if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. The next day, at 10 a.m., the President again turned on the secret tape recorder. He read aloud a wire service report that had just been handed to him. Premier Khrushchev told President Kennedy in a message today he would withdraw offensive weapons from Cuba if the United States withdrew its rockets from Turkey, Jupiter missiles with nuclear warheads. The report was soon authenticated. Though received by the committee as an unexpected bolt from the blue, it had actually been anticipated. We've known this might be coming for a week, Kennedy informed them. To refuse public acquiescence would be difficult, he realized, these were obsolete missiles, already slated for withdrawal, soon to be replaced by far more lethal and effectively invulnerable submarine-based Polaris missiles. Kennedy recognized that he would be in an insupportable position if this becomes Khrushchev's proposal, both because the Turkish missiles were useless and were being withdrawn anyway, and because to any man at the United Nations or any other rational man, it will look like a very fair trade. Who Rules the World? By Noam Chomsky. Audiobook by The Learner's Library. Chapter 8. The Week the World Stood Still. Chapter 9. The Oslo Accords, Their Context, Their Consequences. Chapter 10. The Eve of Destruction. Chapter 11. Israel-Palestine, The Real Options. Chapter 12. Nothing for Other People, Class War in the United States. Chapter 13. Whose Security? How Washington Protects Itself and the Corporate Sector. Chapter 14. Outrage. Chapter 15. How Many Minutes to Midnight? Chapter 16. Ceasefires in which violations never cease. Keeping U.S. power unrestrained. The planners therefore faced a serious dilemma. They had in hand two somewhat different proposals from Khrushchev to end the threat of catastrophic war, and each would seem to any rational man to be a fair trade. How then to react? One possibility would have been to breathe a sigh of relief that civilization could survive and to eagerly accept both offers, to announce that the United States would adhere to international law and remove any threat to invade Cuba, and to carry forward the withdrawal of the obsolete missiles in Turkey, proceeding as planned to upgrade the nuclear threat against the Soviet Union to a far greater one, only part, of course, of the global encirclement of Russia. But that was unthinkable. The basic reason why no such thought could be contemplated was spelled out by National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, a former Harvard dean and reputedly the brightest star in the Camelot firmament. The world, he insisted, must come to understand that the current threat to peace is not in Turkey, it is in Cuba, where missiles were directed against the United States. A vastly more powerful U.S. missile force trained on the much weaker and more vulnerable Soviet enemy could not possibly be regarded as a threat to peace, because we are good, as a great many people in the Western Hemisphere and beyond could testify, among numerous others, the victims of the ongoing terrorist war that the United States was then waging against Cuba, or those swept up in the campaign of hatred in the Arab world that so puzzled Eisenhower, though not the National Security Council, which explained it clearly. In subsequent colloquy, the President stressed that we would be in a bad position if we chose to set off an international conflagration by rejecting proposals that would seem quite reasonable to survivors, if any cared. This pragmatic stance was about as far as moral considerations could reach. In a review of recently released documents on Kennedy-era terror, Harvard University Latin Americanist Jorge Dominguez observes, only once in these nearly 1,000 pages of documentation did a U.S. official raise something that resembled a faint moral objection to U.S. government-sponsored terrorism. A member of the National Security Council staff suggested that raids that are haphazard and kill innocents might mean a bad press in some friendly countries. The same attitudes prevailed throughout the internal discussions during the missile crisis, as when Robert Kennedy warned that a full-scale invasion of Cuba would kill an awful lot of people, and we're going to take an awful lot of heat on it. And they prevail to the present, with only the rarest of exceptions, as easily documented. We might have been in even a worse position if the world had known more about what the United States was doing at the time. Only recently was it learned that, 6 months earlier, the United States had secretly deployed missiles in Okinawa virtually identical to those the Russians would send to Cuba. Point 21 These were surely aimed at China at a moment of elevated regional tensions. To this day, Okinawa remains a major offensive U.S. military base over the bitter objections of its inhabitants. An indecent disrespect for the opinions of humankind. The deliberations that followed are revealing, but I will put them aside here. They did reach a conclusion. The United States pledged to withdraw the obsolete missiles from Turkey, but would not do so publicly or put the offer in writing. It was important that Khrushchev be seen to capitulate. An interesting justification was offered, and is accepted as reasonable by scholarship and commentary. As Michael Dobbs puts it, if it appeared that the United States was dismantling the missile bases unilaterally, under pressure from the Soviet Union, the NATO alliance might crack, or, to rephrase a little more accurately, if the United States replaced useless missiles with a far more lethal threat, as already planned, in a trade with Russia that any rational man would regard as very fair, then the NATO alliance might crack. To be sure, when Russia withdrew Cuba's only deterrent against an ongoing U.S. attack, with a severe threat to proceed to direct invasion still in the air, and quietly departed from the scene, the Cubans would be infuriated, as, in fact, they understandably were. But that is an unfair comparison for the standard reasons: we are human beings who matter, while they are merely one people, to adopt George Orwell's useful phrase. Kennedy also made an informal pledge not to invade Cuba, but with conditions, not just the withdrawal of the missiles, but also termination, or at least a great lessening, of any Russian military presence. Unlike Turkey, on Russia's borders, where nothing of the kind from our military could be contemplated. When Cuba was no longer an armed camp, then, we probably wouldn't invade, in the president's words. He added that if it hoped to be free from the threat of U.S. invasion, Cuba must end its political subversion. Sheldon Stern's phrase, in Latin America. Political subversion had been a constant theme in U.S. rhetoric for years, invoked for example when Eisenhower overthrew the parliamentary government of Guatemala and plunged that tortured country into an abyss from which it has yet to emerge. This theme remained alive and well right through Ronald Reagan's vicious terror wars in Central America in the 1980s. Cuba's political subversion consisted of support for those resisting the murderous assaults of the United States and its client regimes, and sometimes even perhaps, horror of horrors, providing arms to the victims. Though these assumptions are so deeply embedded in prevailing doctrine as to be virtually invisible, they are occasionally articulated in the internal record. In the case of Cuba, the State Department policy planning staff explained that the primary danger we face in Castro is in the impact the very existence of his regime has upon the leftist movement in many Latin American countries. The simple fact is that Castro represents a successful defiance of the U.S., a negation of our whole hemispheric policy of almost a century and a half, since the Monroe Doctrine announced Washington's intention, then unrealizable, to dominate the Western Hemisphere. The right to dominate is a leading principle of U.S. foreign policy found almost everywhere, though typically concealed in defensive terms, during the Cold War years, routinely by invoking the Russian threat, even when Russians were nowhere in sight. An example of great contemporary import is revealed in Iran scholar Ervind Abrahamian's important book, on the US-UK coup that overthrew the parliamentary regime of Iran in 1953. With scrupulous examination of internal records, he shows convincingly that standard accounts cannot be sustained. The primary causes were not Cold War concerns, nor Iranian irrationality that undermined Washington's benign intentions, nor even access to oil or profits, but rather the way the U.S. demand for overall control, with its broader implications for global dominance, was threatened by independent nationalism. That is what we discover over and over by investigating particular cases, including Cuba, not surprisingly, though the fanaticism in that particular case might merit examination. U.S. policy toward Cuba is harshly condemned throughout Latin America and indeed most of the world, but a decent respect for the opinions of mankind is understood to be meaningless rhetoric intoned mindlessly on the 4th of July. Ever since polls have been taken on the matter, a considerable majority of the U.S. population has favored normalization of relations with Cuba, but that too is insignificant. Dismissal of public opinion is, of course, quite normal. What is interesting in this case is dismissal of powerful sectors of U.S. economic power which also favor normalization, and are usually highly influential in setting policy, energy, agribusiness, pharmaceuticals, and others. That suggests that, in addition to the cultural factors revealed in the hysteria of the Camelot intellectuals, there is a powerful state interest involved in punishing Cubans, saving the world from the threat of nuclear destruction. The missile crisis officially ended on October 28. The outcome was not obscure. That evening, in a special CBS News broadcast, Charles Collingwood reported that the world had come out from under the most terrible threat of nuclear holocaust since World War II, with a humiliating defeat for Soviet policy. Dobbs comments that the Russians tried to pretend that the outcome was yet another triumph for Moscow's peace-loving foreign policy over warmongering imperialists, and that the supremely wise, always reasonable Soviet leadership had saved the world from the threat of nuclear destruction. Extricating the basic facts from the fashionable ridicule, Khrushchev's agreement to capitulate had indeed saved the world from the threat of nuclear destruction. The crisis, however, was not over. On November 8, the Pentagon announced that all known Soviet missile bases had been dismantled. On the same day, Stern reports, a sabotage team carried out an attack on a Cuban factory, though Kennedy's terror campaign, Operation Mongoose, had been formally curtailed at the peak of the crisis. The November 8 terror attack lends support to McGeorge Bundy's observation that the threat to peace was Cuba, not Turkey, where the Russians were not continuing a lethal assault, though it was certainly not what Bundy had in mind or could have understood. More details are added by the respected scholar Raymond Garthoff, who also had rich experience within the government, in his careful 1987 account of the missile crisis. On November 8, he writes, a Cuban covert action sabotage team dispatched from the United States successfully blew up a Cuban industrial facility, killing 400 workers, according to a Cuban government letter to the UN Secretary General. Garthoff comments, the Soviets could only see the attack as an effort to backpedal on what was, for them, the key question remaining, American assurances not to attack Cuba, particularly since the terrorist attack was launched from the United States. These and other third-party actions reveal again, he concludes, that the risk and danger to both sides could have been extreme, and catastrophe not excluded. Garthoff also reviews the murderous and destructive operations of Kennedy's terrorist campaign, which we would certainly regard as more than ample justification for war if the United States or its allies or clients were its victims, not its perpetrators. From the same source we learn further that, on August 23, 1962, the President had issued National Security Action Memorandum, NSAM, No. 181, a directive to engineer an internal revolt that would be followed by U.S. military intervention, involving significant U.S. military plans, maneuvers, and movement of forces and equipment that were surely known to Cuba and Russia. Also in August, terrorist attacks were intensified, including speedboat strafing attacks on a Cuban seaside hotel, where Soviet military technicians were known to congregate, killing a score of Russians and Cubans, attacks on British and Cuban cargo ships, the contamination of sugar shipments, and other atrocities and sabotage, mostly carried out by Cuban exile organizations permitted to operate freely in Florida. Shortly after came the most dangerous moment in human history, not exactly out of the blue. Kennedy officially renewed the terrorist operations after the crisis ebbed. 10 days before his assassination, he approved a CIA plan for destruction operations by U.S. proxy forces against a large oil refinery and storage facilities, a large electric plant, sugar refineries, railroad bridges, harbor facilities, and underwater demolition of docks and ships. A plot to assassinate Castro was apparently initiated on the day of the Kennedy assassination. The terrorist campaign was called off in 1965, but, reports Garthoff, one of Nixon's first acts in office in 1969 was to direct the CIA to intensify covert operations against Cuba. We can, at last, hear the voices of the victims in Canadian historian Keith Bollender's Voices from the Other Side, the first oral history of the terror campaign, one of many books unlikely to receive more than casual notice, if that, in the West because its contents are too revealing. In the Political Science Quarterly, the professional journal of the American Political Science Association, Montague Kern observes that the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of those full-bore crises, in which an ideological enemy, the Soviet Union, is universally perceived to have gone on the attack, leading to a rally-round-the-flag effect that greatly expands support for a president, increasing his policy options. Kern is right that it is universally perceived that way. Apart from those who have escaped sufficiently from their ideological shackles to pay some attention to the facts, Kern is, in fact, one of them. Another is Sheldon Stern, who recognizes what has long been known to such deviants. As he writes, we now know that Khrushchev's original explanation for shipping missiles to Cuba had been fundamentally true. The Soviet leader had never intended these weapons as a threat to the security of the United States, but rather considered their deployment a defensive move to protect his Cuban allies from American attacks and as a desperate effort to give the USSR the appearance of equality in the nuclear balance of power. Dobbs, too, recognizes that Castro and his Soviet patrons had real reasons to fear American attempts at regime change, including, as a last resort, a U.S. invasion of Cuba. Khrushchev was also sincere in his desire to defend the Cuban Revolution from the mighty neighbor to the north. Terrors of the Earth. The American attacks are often dismissed in U.S. commentary as silly pranks, CIA shenanigans that got out of hand. That is far from the truth. The best and the brightest had reacted to the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion with near hysteria, including the president, who solemnly informed the country, the complacent, the self-indulgent, the soft societies are about to be swept away with the debris of history. Only the strong can possibly survive. And they could only survive, he evidently believed, by massive terror, though that addendum was kept secret, and is still not known to loyalists who perceive the ideological enemy as having gone on the attack. The near-universal perception, as Kern observes. After the Bay of Pigs defeat, historian Piero Gleigeses writes, JFK launched a crushing embargo to punish the Cubans for defeating a U.S.-run invasion, and asked his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to lead the top-level interagency group that oversaw Operation Mongoose, a program of paramilitary operations, economic warfare, and sabotage he launched in late 1961 to visit the terrors of the earth on Fidel Castro and, more prosaically, to topple him. The phrase terrors of the earth is Arthur Schlesinger's, in his quasi-official biography of Robert Kennedy, who was assigned responsibility for conducting the terrorist war and who informed the CIA that the Cuban problem carries the top priority in the United States government. All else is secondary. No time, no effort, or manpower is to be spared in the effort to overthrow the Castro regime. The Mongoose operations were run by Edward Lansdale, who had ample experience in counterinsurgency, a standard term for terrorism that we direct. He provided a timetable leading to open revolt and overthrow of the communist regime in October 1962. The final definition of the program recognized that final success will require decisive U.S. military intervention, after terrorism and subversion had laid the basis for it. The implication was that U.S. military intervention would take place in October 1962, when the missile crisis erupted. The events just reviewed help explain why Cuba and Russia had good reason to take such threats seriously. Years later, Robert McNamara recognized that Cuba was justified in fearing an attack. If I were in Cuban or Soviet shoes, I would have thought so, too, he observed at a major conference on the missile crisis on its 40th anniversary. As for Russia's desperate effort to give the USSR the appearance of equality, to which Stern refers, recall that Kennedy's very narrow victory in the 1960 election relied heavily on a fabricated missile gap, concocted to terrify the country and to condemn the Eisenhower administration as soft on national security. There was indeed a missile gap, but strongly in favor of the United States. The first public, unequivocal administration statement on the true facts, according to strategic analyst Desmond Ball in his authoritative study of the Kennedy missile program, was in October 1961, when Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell Gilpatrick informed the Business Council that the U.S. would have a larger nuclear delivery system left after a surprise attack than the nuclear force which the Soviet Union could employ in its first strike. The Russians, of course, were well aware of their relative weakness and vulnerability. They were also aware of Kennedy's reaction when Khrushchev offered to sharply reduce offensive military capacity, and proceeded to do so unilaterally. The president failed to respond, undertaking instead a huge armaments program. Owning the world, then and now. The two most crucial questions about the missile crisis are, how did it begin? And how did it end? It began with Kennedy's terrorist attack against Cuba, with a threat of invasion in October 1962. It ended with the president's rejection of Russian offers that would seem fair to a rational person, but were unthinkable because they would have undermined the fundamental principle that the United States has the unilateral right to deploy nuclear missiles anywhere, aimed at China or Russia or anyone else, even on their borders, and the accompanying principle that Cuba had no right to have missiles for defense against what appeared to be an imminent U.S. invasion. To establish these principles firmly, it was entirely proper to face a high risk of a war of unimaginable destruction and to reject simple, and admittedly fair ways to end the threat. Garthoff observes that, in the United States, there was almost universal approbation for President Kennedy's handling of the crisis. Dobbs writes, the relentlessly upbeat tone was established by the court historian, Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., who wrote that Kennedy had dazzled the world through a combination of toughness and restraint, of will, nerve and wisdom, so brilliantly controlled, so matchlessly calibrated. Rather more soberly, Stern partially agrees, noting that Kennedy repeatedly rejected the militant advice of his advisors and associates who called for military force, and the dismissal of peaceful options. The events of October 1962 are widely hailed as Kennedy's finest hour. Graham Allison joins many others in presenting them as a guide for how to defuse conflicts, manage great power relationships, and make sound decisions about foreign policy in general. In a very narrow sense, that judgment seems reasonable. The XCOM tapes reveal that the president stood apart from others, sometimes almost all others, in rejecting premature violence. There is, however, a further question. How should JFK's relative moderation in the management of the crisis be evaluated, against the background of the broader considerations just reviewed? But that question does not arise in a disciplined intellectual and moral culture, which accepts without question the basic principle that the United States effectively owns the world by right and is by definition a force for good despite occasional errors and misunderstandings, a principle in which it is plainly entirely proper for the United States to deploy massive offensive force all over the world, while it is an outrage for others, allies and clients apart, to make even the slightest gesture in that direction, or even to think of deterring the threatened use of violence by the benign global hegemon. That doctrine is the primary official charge against Iran today. It might pose a deterrent to U.S. and Israeli force. This was a consideration during the missile crisis as well. In internal discussion, the Kennedy brothers expressed their fears that Cuban missiles might deter a U.S. invasion of Venezuela then under consideration. So, the Bay of Pigs was really right, JFK concluded. These principles still contribute to the constant risk of nuclear war. There has been no shortage of severe dangers since the missile crisis. 10 years later, during the 1973 Israeli-Arab War, National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger called a high-level nuclear alert, DEFCON 3, to warn the Russians to keep their hands off while he was secretly authorizing Israel to violate the ceasefire imposed by the United States and Russia. When Ronald Reagan came into office a few years later, the United States launched operations probing Russian defenses and simulating air and naval attacks, while placing Pershing missiles in Germany that had a 5 to 10-minute flight time to Russian targets, providing what the CIA called a super sudden first strike capability. Naturally, this caused great alarm in Russia, which unlike the United States has repeatedly been invaded and virtually destroyed. That led to a major war scare in 1983. There have also been hundreds of cases when human intervention aborted a first strike minutes before launch after automated systems gave false alarms. We don't have Russian records, but there's no doubt that their systems are far more accident-prone. Meanwhile, India and Pakistan have come close to nuclear war several times, and the sources of their conflict remain. Both have refused to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty, along with Israel, and have received U.S. support for development of their nuclear weapons programs. In 1962, war was avoided by Khrushchev's willingness to accept Kennedy's hegemonic demands. But we can hardly count on such sanity forever. It's a near miracle that nuclear war has so far been avoided. There is more reason than ever to attend to the warning of Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein, almost 60 years ago, that we must face a choice that is stark and dreadful and inescapable. Shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war? 9. The Oslo Accords, their context, their consequences. In September 1993, President Clinton presided over a handshake between Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat on the White House lawn, capping off a day of awe, as the press described it with reverence. The occasion was the announcement of the Declaration of Principles, DOP, for political settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict, which resulted from secret meetings in Oslo sponsored by the Norwegian government. Independent negotiations had been underway between Israel and the Palestinians since November 1991, initiated by the United States during the glow of success after the First Iraq War, which established that, what we say goes, in the triumphant words of President George H. W. Bush. The negotiations opened with a brief conference in Madrid and continued under the guiding hand of the United States, and technically, the fading Soviet Union, to provide the illusion of international auspices. The Palestinian delegation, consisting of Palestinians within the occupied territories, henceforth the internal Palestinians, was led by the dedicated and incorruptible left nationalist Haidar Abdul Shafi, probably the most respected figure in Palestine. The external Palestinians, the PLO, based in Tunis and headed by Yasser Arafat, were excluded, though they had an unofficial observer, Faisal Husseini. The huge number of Palestinian refugees were totally excluded, with no regard for their rights, even those accorded them by the UN General Assembly. To appreciate the nature and significance of the Oslo Accords and the consequences that flowed from them, it is important to understand the background and the context in which the Madrid and Oslo negotiations took place. I will begin by reviewing highlights of the immediate background that set the context for the negotiations, then turn to the DOP and the consequences of the Oslo process, which extend to the present, and finally add a few words on lessons that should be learned. The PLO, Israel, and the United States had recently released formal positions on the basic issues that were the topic of the Madrid and Oslo negotiations. The PLO position was presented in a November 1988 declaration of the Palestinian National Council, carrying forward a long series of diplomatic initiatives that had been dismissed. It called for a Palestinian state to be established in the territories occupied by Israel since 1967 and requested the UN Security Council to formulate and guarantee arrangements for security and peace between all the states concerned in the region, including the Palestinian state alongside Israel. The PNC declaration, which accepted the overwhelming international consensus on a diplomatic settlement, was virtually the same as the two-state resolution brought to the Security Council in January 1976 by the Arab confrontation states, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. It was vetoed by the United States then, and again in 1980. For 40 years the United States has blocked the international consensus, and it still does, diplomatic pleasantries aside. By 1988, Washington's rejectionist stance was becoming difficult to sustain. By December, the outgoing Reagan administration had become an international laughingstock with its increasingly desperate efforts to pretend that, alone in the world, it could not hear the accommodating proposals of the PLO and the Arab states. Grudgingly, Washington decided to declare victory, claiming that at last the PLO had been compelled to utter Secretary of State George Shultz's magic words, and express its willingness to pursue diplomacy. As Shultz makes clear in his memoirs, the goal was to ensure maximum humiliation of the PLO while admitting that peace offers could no longer be denied. He informed President Reagan that Arafat was saying in one place, UNC, 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 and in another he was saying, CLE, 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 but nowhere will he yet bring himself to say, Uncle, conceding total capitulation in the humble style expected of the lower orders. Low-level discussions with the PLO would therefore be allowed, but on the understanding that they would be meaningless, specifically, It was stipulated that the PLO must abandon its request for an international conference, so that the United States would maintain control. In May 1989, Israel's Likud Labor Coalition government formally responded to Palestinian acceptance of a two-state settlement, declaring that there could be no additional Palestinian state between Jordan and Israel. Jordan already being a Palestinian state by Israeli dictate, whatever Jordanians and Palestinians might think, and that there will be no change in the status of Judea, Samaria and Gaza, the West Bank and Gaza, other than in accordance with the basic guidelines of the Israeli government. Furthermore, Israel would conduct no negotiations with the PLO, though it would permit free elections under Israeli military rule, with much of the Palestinian leadership in prison without charge or expelled from Palestine. In the plan proposed by Secretary of State James A. Baker, the new Bush administration endorsed this proposal without qualifications in December 1989. Those were the three formal positions on the eve of the Madrid negotiations, with Washington mediating as the honest broker. When Arafat went to Washington to take part in the Day of Awe in September 1993, the lead story in the New York Times celebrated the handshake as a dramatic image that will transform Mr. Arafat into a statesman and peacemaker who finally renounced violence under Washington's tutelage. At the extreme critical end of the mainstream, New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis wrote that until that moment Palestinians had always rejected compromise, but now at last they were willing to make peace possible. Of course, it was the United States and Israel that had rejected diplomacy and the PLO that had been offering compromise for years, but Lewis's reversal of the facts was quite normal and unchallenged in the mainstream. There were other crucial developments in the immediate pre-Madrid/pre-Oslo years. In December 1987, the Intifada erupted in Gaza and quickly spread throughout the occupied territories. This broad-based and remarkably restrained uprising was as much of a surprise to the PLO in Tunis as it was to the occupying Israeli forces with their extensive system of military and paramilitary forces, surveillance, and collaborators. The Intifada was not limited to opposing the occupation. It was also a social revolution within Palestinian society, breaking patterns of subordination of women, authority by notables, and other forms of hierarchy and domination. Though the timing of the Intifada was a surprise, the uprising itself was not, at least to those who paid any attention to Israel's US-backed operations within the territories. Something was bound to happen. There is only so much that people can endure. For the preceding 20 years, Palestinians under military occupation had been subjected to harsh repression, brutality, and cruel humiliation while watching what remained of their country disappear before their eyes as Israel conducted its programs of settlement, implemented huge infrastructure developments designed to integrate valuable parts of the territories within Israel, robbed them of resources, and put into place other measures to bar independent development, always with crucial U.S. military, economic, and diplomatic support, as well as ideological backing in shaping how the issues were framed. To take just one of the many cases that elicited no notice or concern in the West, shortly before the outbreak of the Intifada, a Palestinian girl, Intisar al-Adar, was shot and killed in a schoolyard in Gaza by a resident of a nearby Jewish settlement. He was one of the several thousand Israelis who settled in Gaza with substantial state subsidies, protected by a huge army presence as they took over much of the land and the scarce water of the Strip while living lavishly in 22 settlements in the midst of 1.4 million destitute Palestinians, as the crime is described by Israeli scholar Avi Raz. The murderer of the schoolgirl, Shimon Yifra, was arrested, but quickly released on bail when the court determined that the offense is not severe enough to warrant detention. The judge commented that Yifra only intended to shock the girl by firing his gun at her in a schoolyard, not to kill her, so this is not a case of a criminal person who has to be punished, deterred, and taught a lesson by imprisoning him. Yifra was given a 7-month suspended sentence while settlers in the courtroom broke out in song and dance. And the usual silence reigned. After all, it was routine. And so it was. As Yifra was freed, the Israeli press reported that an army patrol fired into the yard of a school in a West Bank refugee camp, wounding 5 children, likewise intending only to shock them. There were no charges, and the event again attracted no attention. It was just another episode in a program of illiteracy as punishment, as the Israeli press termed it, including the closing of schools, the use of gas bombs, the beating of students with rifle butts, and the barring of medical aid for victims. Beyond the schools, a reign of even more severe brutality that became yet more savage during the Intifada was enacted under the orders of Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin. After 2 years of violent and sadistic repression, Rabin informed Peace Now leaders that the inhabitants of the territories are subject to harsh military and economic pressure. In the end, they will be broken, and would accept Israel's terms, as they did when Arafat restored control through the Oslo process. The Madrid negotiations between Israel and internal Palestinians continued inconclusively from 1991, primarily because Abdul Shafi insisted on an end to the expansion of Israeli settlements. The settlements were all illegal, as had repeatedly been determined by international authorities, including the UN Security Council, among other resolutions, in UNSC 446, passed 12-0, with the United States, the United Kingdom, and Norway abstaining. The illegality of the settlements was later affirmed by the International Court of Justice. It had also been recognized by Israel's highest legal authorities and government officials in late 1967, when the settlement projects were beginning. The criminal enterprise included the vast expansion and annexation of Greater Jerusalem, in explicit violation of repeated Security Council orders. Israel's position as the Madrid Conference opened was summarized accurately by Israeli journalist Danny Rubenstein, one of the best-informed analysts on the topic of the occupied territories. He wrote that, at Madrid, Israel and the United States would agree to some form of Palestinian autonomy, as required by the 1978 Camp David Accords, but it would be autonomy as in a POW camp, where the prisoners are autonomous to cook their meals without interference and to organize cultural events. Palestinians would be granted little more than what they already had, control over local services, and the Israeli settlement programs would continue. While the Madrid negotiations and the secret Oslo negotiations were underway, these programs expanded rapidly, under first Yitzhak Shamir and then Yitzhak Rabin, who became prime minister in 1992 and boasted that more housing in the territories is being built during his tenure than at any time since 1967. Rabin explained the guiding principle succinctly: what is important is what is within the boundaries, and it is less important where the boundaries are, as long as the State of Israel covers most of the territory of the land of Israel, Eretz Israel, the former Palestine, whose capital is Jerusalem. Israeli researchers reported that the aim of the Rabin government was to radically expand the Greater Jerusalem zone of influence, extending from Ramallah to Hebron to the border of Ma'ale Adumim, near Jericho, and to finish creating circles of contiguous Jewish settlements in the Greater Jerusalem zone of influence, so as to further surround the Palestinian communities, limit their development, and prevent any possibility that East Jerusalem could become a Palestinian capital. Furthermore, a vast network of roads has been under construction, forming the backbone of the settlement pattern. The programs were expanded rapidly after the Oslo Accords, including new settlements and the thickening of old ones, special inducements to attract new settlers, and highway projects to cantonize the territory. Excluding annexed East Jerusalem, building starts increased by over 40% from 1993 to 1995, according to a Peace Now study. Government funding for settlements in the territories increased by 70% in 1994, the year following the Accords. Davar, the journal of the governing Labour Party, reported that Rabin's administration was maintaining the priorities of the ultra-right Shamir government it replaced. While pretending to freeze settlements, Labour helped them financially even more than the Shamir government had ever done, enlarging settlements everywhere in the West Bank, even in the most provocative spots. This policy was carried forward in the following years, and is the basis for the current programs of the Netanyahu government. It is designed to leave Israel in control of some 40 to 50% of the West Bank, with the rest cantonized, imprisoned as Israel takes over the Jordan Valley, and separated from Gaza, in explicit violation of the Oslo Accords, thus ensuring that any potential Palestinian entity will have no access to the outside world. The Intifada was initiated and carried out by the internal Palestinians. The PLO, in Tunis, tried to exert some control over the events but with little success. The programs of the early 1990s, while negotiations were in process, deepened the alienation of the internal Palestinians from the PLO leadership abroad. Under these circumstances, it was not surprising that Arafat sought a way to re-establish PLO authority. The opportunity was offered by the secret negotiations between Arafat and Israel under Norwegian auspices that undercut the local leadership. As they were concluded in August 1993, the growing PLO estrangement was reviewed by Lamis Andoni, one of the few journalists who was keeping a close watch on what was happening among the Palestinians under occupation, and in refugee camps in neighboring countries. Andoni reported that the PLO is facing the worst crisis since its inception, as Palestinian groups, except for Fatah, and independents are distancing themselves from the PLO, and the shrinking clique around Yasser Arafat. She reported further that two top PLO executive committee members, Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish and Shafiq al-Hout, have resigned from the PLO executive committee, while Palestinian negotiators were offering their resignations, and even groups that remained inside were distancing themselves from Arafat. The leader of Fatah in Lebanon called on Arafat to resign, while opposition to him personally and to PLO corruption and autocracy were mounting in the territories. Along with the rapid disintegration of the mainstream group and Arafat's loss of support within his own movement, the speedy disintegration of the PLO's institutions and the steady erosion of the organization's constituency could render any breakthrough at the peace talks meaningless. At no point in the PLO's history has opposition to the leadership, and to Arafat himself, been as strong, Andoni observed, while for the first time there is a growing feeling that safeguarding Palestinian national rights no longer hinges on defending the PLO's role. Many believe that it is the leadership's policies that are destroying Palestinian institutions, and jeopardizing Palestinian national rights. For such reasons, she observed, Arafat was pursuing the Jericho-Gaza option offered by the Oslo Agreement, which he hoped would assert the PLO's authority, especially amid signs that the Israeli government could go the extra 10 miles by talking directly to the PLO, thus salvaging for it the legitimacy it is losing internally. Israeli authorities were surely aware of the developments within Palestine, and presumably came to appreciate that it made good sense to deal with those who were destroying Palestinian institutions and jeopardizing Palestinian national rights, before the population sought to realize its national goals and rights in some other way. Reaction to the Oslo Accords among Palestinians within the territories was mixed. Some had high hopes. Others saw little to celebrate. The provisions of the agreement have alarmed even the most moderate Palestinians, who worry that the accord consolidates Israeli control in the territories, Lamis Andoni reported. Saeb Erekat, a senior Palestinian negotiator, commented that, apparently this agreement aims at reorganizing the Israeli occupation and not at a gradual termination. Even Faisal Husseini, who was close to Arafat, said that the accord is definitely not the beginning that our people were looking for. Haidar Abdul Shafi criticized the PLO leadership for accepting an agreement that permitted Israel to continue its settlement policies and land appropriation, as well as the annexation and Judaization of its expanded Jerusalem area and its economic hegemony over Palestinians, and refused to attend the celebration on the White House lawn. Particularly grating to many was what they saw as the shabby behavior of the PLO leadership, including a pattern of ignoring Palestinians, who have suffered through 27 years of Israeli occupation in favor of exiles coming from Tunis to take power, Youssef Ibrahim reported in the New York Times. He added that PLO representatives were pelted with stones by Palestinian youths as they rode into Jericho in Israeli army jeeps. Arafat's provisional list for his governing authority revealed that he is determined to stack it with loyalists and members of the Palestinian diaspora. Julian Ozan reported from Jerusalem in the Financial Times, including only 2 Palestinian insiders, Faisal Husseini and Zakaria Alaga, both Arafat loyalists. The rest came from Arafat's loyal political factions outside the territories. A look at the actual contents of the Oslo Accords reveals that such reactions were, if anything, overly optimistic. The Declaration of Principles was quite explicit about satisfying Israel's demands, but was silent on Palestinian national rights. It conformed to the conception articulated by Dennis Ross, President Clinton's main Middle East advisor and negotiator at Camp David in 2000 and later a key advisor for Obama as well. As Ross explained, Israel has needs, but Palestinians have only wants, obviously of lesser significance. Article 1 of the DOP states that the end result of the process is to be a permanent settlement based on Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338. Those familiar with the diplomacy concerning the Israel-Palestine conflict should have had no difficulty understanding what this meant. Resolutions 242 and 338 say nothing at all about Palestinian rights, apart from a vague reference to a just settlement of the refugee problem. Later resolutions referring to Palestinian national rights were ignored in the DOP. If the culmination of the peace process is implemented along such lines, then Palestinians could kiss goodbye their hopes for some limited degree of national rights in the former Palestine. Further articles of the DOP spell all of this out more clearly. They stipulate that Palestinian Authority extends over West Bank and Gaza Strip territory, except for issues that will be negotiated in the permanent status negotiations, Jerusalem, settlements, military locations, and Israelis, that is, except for every issue of significance. Furthermore, subsequent to the Israeli withdrawal, Israel will continue to be responsible for external security, and for internal security and public order of settlements and Israelis. Israeli military forces and civilians may continue to use roads freely within the Gaza Strip and the Jericho area, the two areas from which Israel was pledged to withdraw, eventually. In short, there would be no meaningful changes. The DOP also did not have a word to say about the settlement programs at the heart of the conflict, which even before the vast expansion under the Oslo process were already undermining realistic prospects of achieving any meaningful Palestinian self-determination. In brief, only by succumbing to what is sometimes called intentional ignorance could one believe that the Oslo process was a path to peace. Nevertheless, this belief became virtual dogma among Western commentators and intellectuals. The Oslo Accords were followed by additional Israel-Arafat/PLO agreements. The first and most important of these was Oslo II, in 1995, shortly before Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated, a tragic event even if the illusions concocted about Rabin the peacemaker cannot sustain analysis. The Oslo II agreement is what one would expect to be crafted by intelligent law students assigned the task of constructing a document that would give U.S. and Israeli authorities the option of doing as they pleased while leaving room for speculation about more acceptable outcomes. When these outcomes remain unrealized, the blame can be laid on the extremists who have undermined the promise. To illustrate, the Oslo II agreement stipulated that settlers, illegally, in the occupied territories would remain under Israeli jurisdiction and legislation. In the official wording, the Israeli military government, in the territories, shall retain the necessary legislative, judicial and executive powers and responsibilities, in accordance with international law, which the United States and Israel have always interpreted as they chose, with tacit European acquiescence. Such latitude also granted these authorities effective veto power over Palestinian legislation. The agreement stated that any such legislation which amends or abrogates existing, Israeli-imposed, laws or military orders, shall have no effect and shall be void ab initio if it exceeds the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Council, which had no authority in most of the territories and authority elsewhere only conditional on Israeli approval, or is otherwise inconsistent with this or any other agreement. Furthermore, the Palestinian side shall respect the legal rights of Israelis, including corporations owned by Israelis, related to lands located in areas under the territorial jurisdiction of the Council, that is, in the limited areas in which the Palestinian authorities were to have jurisdiction subject to Israeli approval, specifically, their rights related to government and so-called absentee land, a complex legal construction that effectively transfers to Israeli jurisdiction the land of Palestinians absent from territories taken by Israel. The latter two categories constitute most of the region, though the government of Israel, which determines their boundaries unilaterally, provided no official figures. The Israeli press reported that unsettled state lands amounted to about half of the West Bank, and total state lands to about 70%. Oslo II thus rescinded the decision of virtually the entire world, and all relevant legal authorities, that Israel has no claim to the territories occupied in 1967 and that the settlements are illegitimate. The Palestinian side recognized their legality, along with unspecified other legal rights of Israelis throughout the territories, including Zones A and B, under conditional Palestinian control. Oslo II implanted more firmly the major accomplishment of Oslo I. All UN resolutions that have any bearing on Palestinian rights were abrogated, including those concerning the legality of settlements, the status of Jerusalem, and the right of return. That wiped out with a stroke virtually the entire record of Middle East diplomacy, apart from the version implemented in the unilateral US-run peace process. The basic facts were not just excised from history, at least in US commentary, but were officially removed as well. So matters have continued, to the present. As noted, it is understandable that Arafat would leap at the opportunity to undercut the internal Palestinian leadership, and to try to reassert his waning power in the territories. But what exactly did the Norwegian negotiators think they were accomplishing? The only serious scholarly study of the matter, to my knowledge, is the work of Hilda Henriksson Waage, who had been commissioned by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to research the topic and was granted access to internal files, only to make the remarkable discovery that the documentary record for the crucial period is missing. Waage observes that the Oslo Accords were certainly a turning point in the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, while also establishing Oslo as the world's capital of peace. The Oslo process was expected to bring peace to the Middle East, Waage writes, but, for the Palestinians, it resulted in the parceling of the West Bank, the doubling of Israeli settlers, the construction of a crippling separation wall, a draconian closure regime, and an unprecedented separation between the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Waage concludes plausibly that the Oslo process could serve as the perfect case study for flaws in the model of third-party mediation by a small state in highly asymmetrical conflicts, and that, as she puts it starkly, the Oslo process was conducted on Israel's premises, with Norway acting as Israel's helpful errand boy. The Norwegians, she writes, believed that through dialogue and a gradual building of trust, an irreversible peace dynamic would be created that could push the process forward to solution. The problem with this entire approach is that the issue is not one of trust, but of power. The facilitative process masks that reality. In the end, the results that can be achieved by a weak third-party facilitator are no more than the strong party will allow. The question to be asked is whether such a model can ever be appropriate. A good question, worth pondering, particularly as educated Western opinion now adopts the ludicrous assumption that meaningful Israel-Palestine negotiations can be seriously conducted under the auspices of the United States as an honest broker, in reality a partner of Israel for 40 years in blocking a diplomatic settlement that has near universal support. 10. The eve of destruction. To ask what the future is likely to bring, a reasonable stance might be to try to look at the human species from the outside. So imagine that you're an extraterrestrial observer who is trying to take a neutral stance and figure out what's happening here, or, for that matter, imagine you're a historian 100 years from now, assuming there are any historians 100 years from now, which is not obvious, and you're looking back at what's happening today. You'd see something quite remarkable. For the first time in the history of the human species, we have clearly developed the capacity to destroy ourselves. That's been true since 1945. It's now being finally recognized that there are more long-term processes like environmental destruction leading in the same direction, maybe not to total destruction, but at least to the destruction of the capacity for a decent existence. And there are other dangers, like pandemics, which have to do with globalization and interaction. So there are processes underway and institutions right in place, like nuclear weapons systems, which could lead to a serious blow to, or maybe the termination of, an organized existence. How to destroy a planet without really trying? The question is, what are people doing about it? None of this is a secret. It's all perfectly open. In fact, you have to make an effort not to see it. And there has been a range of reactions. There are those who are trying hard to do something about these threats, and others who are acting to escalate them. If you, this future historian or extraterrestrial observer, looked at who is in each group, you would see something strange indeed. Those trying to mitigate or overcome these threats are the least developed societies, the indigenous populations, or the remnants of them, tribal societies, and First Nations in Canada. They're not talking about nuclear war but environmental disaster, and they're really trying to do something about it. In fact, all over the world, Australia, India, South America, there are battles going on, sometimes wars. In India, it's a major war over direct environmental destruction, with tribal societies trying to resist resource extraction operations that are extremely harmful locally but also in their general consequences. In societies where indigenous populations have influence, many are taking a strong stand. The strongest stance of any country with regard to global warming is that of Bolivia, which has an indigenous majority and constitutional requirements that protect the rights of nature. Ecuador, which also has a large indigenous population, is the only oil exporter I know of whose government is seeking aid to help keep that oil in the ground instead of producing and exporting it, and the ground is where it ought to be. Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, who died recently, and who was the object of mockery, insult, and hatred throughout the Western world, attended a session of the UN General Assembly a few years ago where he elicited all sorts of ridicule for calling George W. Bush a devil. He also gave a speech there that was quite interesting. Venezuela is a major oil producer. Oil is practically their whole gross domestic product. In his speech, Chavez warned of the dangers of the overuse of fossil fuels and urged producer and consumer countries to get together and try to work out ways to reduce fossil fuel use. That was pretty amazing on the part of an oil producer. Chavez was part Indian, of indigenous background. Unlike the funny things he did, this aspect of his actions at the United Nations was never even reported. So, at one extreme you have indigenous, tribal societies trying to stem the race to disaster. At the other extreme, the richest, most powerful societies in world history, like the United States and Canada, are racing full speed ahead to destroy the environment as quickly as possible. Unlike Ecuador and indigenous societies throughout the world, they want to extract every drop of hydrocarbons from the ground with all possible speed. Both political parties, President Obama, the media, and the international press seem to be looking forward with great enthusiasm to what they call a century of energy independence for the United States. Energy independence is an almost meaningless concept, but put that aside. What they mean is, we'll have a century in which to maximize the use of fossil fuels and contribute to the destruction of the world. And that's pretty much the case everywhere. Admittedly, when it comes to alternative energy development, Europe's doing something. Meanwhile, the United States, the richest and most powerful country in world history, is the only nation among perhaps 100 relevant ones that doesn't have a national policy for restricting the use of fossil fuels, that doesn't even have renewable energy targets. It's not because the population doesn't want it. Americans are pretty close to the international norm in their concern about global warming. It's institutional structures that block change. Business interests don't want it, and they're overwhelmingly powerful in determining policy. So you get a big gap between opinion and policy on lots of issues, including this one. So that's what the future historian, if there is one, would see. He might also read today's scientific journals. Just about every one you open has a more dire prediction than the last. The other issue is nuclear war. It's been known for a long time that if there were to be a first strike by a major power, even with no retaliation, it would probably destroy civilization just because of the nuclear winter consequences that would follow. You can read about it in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. It's well understood. So the danger has always been a lot worse than we thought it was. We've recently passed the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a very close call, and not the only time either. In some ways, however, the worst aspect of these grim events is that their lessons haven't been learned. 10 years after those events, in 1973, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger called a high-level nuclear alert. It was his way of warning the Russians not to interfere in the ongoing Israeli-Arab war and, in particular, not to interfere after he had informed the Israelis that they could violate a ceasefire the United States and Russia had just agreed upon. Fortunately, nothing happened. 10 years after that, President Ronald Reagan was in office. Soon after he entered the Oval Office, he and his advisors had the U.S. Air Force start penetrating Russian airspace to try to elicit information about Russian warning systems. This was called Operation Able Archer. Essentially, these were mock attacks. The Russians were uncertain how to respond, with some high-level officials fearing that this was a step toward a real first strike. Fortunately, they didn't react, though it was a close call. And it goes on like that. What to make of the Iranian and North Korean nuclear crises? The nuclear issue is regularly front-page news in the cases of Iran and North Korea. There are ways to deal with these ongoing crises. Maybe they wouldn't work, but at least they could be tried. They are, however, not being considered, not even reported. Take the case of Iran, which is considered in the West, not in the Arab world, not in Asia, the gravest threat to world peace. It's a Western obsession, and it's interesting to look into the reasons, but I'll put that aside here. Is there a way to deal with the supposed gravest threat to world peace? Actually, there are quite a few. One way, a pretty sensible one, was proposed at a meeting of the non-aligned countries in Tehran in 2013. In fact, they were just reiterating a proposal that's been around for decades, pressed particularly by Egypt, and has been approved by the UN General Assembly. The proposal is to move toward establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. That wouldn't be the answer to everything, but it would be a pretty significant step forward. And there were ways to proceed. Under UN auspices, there was to be an international conference in Finland in December 2012 to try to implement such a plan. What happened? You won't read about it in the newspapers, because it was only reported in specialist journals. In early November, Iran agreed to attend the meeting. A couple of days later Obama cancelled the meeting, saying the time wasn't right. The European Parliament issued a statement calling for it to continue, as did the Arab states. Nothing resulted. In Northeast Asia, it's the same sort of thing. North Korea may be the craziest country in the world, it's certainly a good competitor for that title. But it does make sense to try to figure out what's in the minds of people when they're acting in crazy ways. Why would they behave the way they do? Just imagine ourselves in their position. Imagine what it meant in the Korean War years of the early 1950s for your country to be totally leveled. Everything destroyed by a huge superpower, which furthermore was gloating about what it was doing. Imagine the imprint that would leave behind. Bear in mind that the North Korean leadership is likely to have read the public military journals of this superpower at that time explaining that since everything in North Korea had been destroyed, the Air Force was then sent to destroy North Korea's dams, huge dams that controlled the nation's water supply. A war crime, by the way, for which people had been hanged in Nuremberg. And these official journals were talking excitedly about how wonderful it was to see the water pouring down, digging out the valleys, and the Asians scurrying around trying to survive. The journals exulted in what this meant to those Asians, horrors beyond our imagination. It meant the destruction of their rice crop, which in turn meant starvation and death. How magnificent! It's not in our memory bank, but it's in theirs. Let's turn to the present. There's an interesting recent history. In 1993, Israel and North Korea were moving toward an agreement in which North Korea would stop sending any missiles or military technology to the Middle East and Israel would recognize that country. President Clinton intervened and blocked it. 6 Shortly after that, in retaliation, North Korea carried out a minor missile test. The United States and North Korea did then reach a framework agreement in 1994 that halted North Korean nuclear work, and was more or less honored by both sides. When George W. Bush came into office, North Korea had maybe one nuclear weapon and verifiably wasn't producing any more. Bush immediately launched his aggressive militarism, threatening North Korea, axis of evil, and all that, so that country got back to work on its nuclear program. By the time Bush left office, it had 8 to 10 nuclear weapons and a missile system. Another great neocon achievement. 7 In between, other things happened. In 2005, the United States and North Korea actually reached an agreement in which North Korea was to end all nuclear weapons and missile development. In return, the West, but mainly the United States, would provide a light water reactor for its medical needs and end aggressive statements. They would then form a non-aggression pact and move toward accommodation. The agreement was pretty promising, but almost immediately Bush undermined it. He withdrew the offer of the light water reactor and initiated programs to compel banks to stop handling any North Korean transactions, even perfectly legal ones. The North Koreans reacted by picking up their nuclear weapons program. And that's the way it's been going. The pattern is well known. You can read it in straight, mainstream American scholarship. What they say is, it's a pretty crazy regime, but it's also following a kind of tit-for-tat policy. You make a hostile gesture, and we'll respond with some crazy gesture of our own. You make an accommodating gesture, and we'll reciprocate in some way. Lately, for instance, there have been South Korean U.S. military exercises on the Korean peninsula which from North Korea's point of view have got to look threatening. We'd think they were threatening if they were going on, aimed at us, in Canada. In the course of these exercises, the most advanced bombers in history, stealth B-2s and B-52s, carried out simulated nuclear bombing attacks right on North Korea's borders. This surely set off alarm bells from the past. The North Koreans remember something from the past, so they're reacting in a very aggressive, extreme way. Well, what generally comes to the West from all this is how crazy and how awful the North Korean leaders are. Yes, they are, but that's hardly the whole story, and this is the way the world is going. It's not that there are no alternatives. The alternatives just aren't being taken. That's dangerous. So if you ask what the world is going to look like, it's not a pretty picture. Unless people do something about it. We always can. 11. Israel-Palestine, the real options. On July 13, 2013, former Shin Bet chief Yuval Diskin issued a dire warning to the government of Israel. Either it would reach some kind of two-state settlement or there would be a shift to a nearly inevitable outcome of the one remaining reality, a state, from the sea to the river. The near-inevitable outcome, one state for two nations, will pose an immediate existential threat of the erasure of the identity of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, which would soon have a Palestinian Arab majority. On similar grounds, in Britain's leading journal of international affairs, two prominent Middle East specialists, Clive Jones and Beverly Milton Edwards, write that, if Israel wishes to be both Jewish and democratic, it must embrace the two-state solution. It is easy to cite many other examples, but unnecessary, because it is assumed almost universally that there are two options for mandatory Palestine, either two states, Palestinian and Jewish democratic, or one state, from the sea to the river. Israeli commentators express concern about the demographic problem, too many Palestinians in a Jewish state. Many Palestinians and their advocates support the one-state solution, anticipating a civil rights, anti-apartheid struggle that will lead to secular democracy. Other analysts also consistently pose the options in similar terms. This analysis is almost universal, but crucially flawed. There is a third option. Namely, the option that Israel is pursuing with constant U.S. support, and this third option is the only realistic alternative to the two-state settlement. It makes sense, in my opinion, to contemplate a future binational secular democracy in the former Palestine, from the sea to the river. For what it's worth, that is what I have advocated for 70 years. But I stress advocated. Advocacy, as distinct from mere proposal, requires sketching a path from here to there. The forms of true advocacy have changed with shifting circumstances. Since the mid-1970s, when Palestinian national rights became a salient issue, the only plausible form of advocacy has been as a staged process beginning with a two-state settlement. No other path has been suggested that has even a remote chance of success. Proposing a binational, one-state, settlement without moving on to advocacy in effect provides support for the third option, the realistic one taking shape before our eyes. Israel is systematically extending plans that were sketched and initiated shortly after the 1967 war, and institutionalized more fully with the accession to power of Menachem Begin's Likud party a decade later. The first step was to create what Yonatan Mendel has called a disturbing new city, still named Jerusalem, but extending far beyond historic Jerusalem, incorporating dozens of Palestinian villages and surrounding lands, and now designated as a Jewish city and the capital of Israel. All of this is in direct violation of explicit Security Council orders. A corridor to the east of this new Greater Jerusalem incorporates the town of Ma'ale Adumim, established in the 1970s but built primarily after the 1993 Oslo Accords, with lands reaching virtually to Jericho, thus effectively bisecting the West Bank. Corridors to the north incorporating the settler towns of Ariel and Kadumim further divide what is to remain under some degree of Palestinian control. Meanwhile, Israel is incorporating the territory on the Israeli side of the illegal separation wall, in reality an annexation wall, taking arable land and water resources and many villages, strangling the town of Qalqilia, and separating Palestinian villagers from their fields. In what Israel calls the seam between the wall and the border, close to 10% of the West Bank, anyone is permitted to enter, except Palestinians. Those who live in the region have to go through an intricate bureaucratic procedure to gain temporary entry. Exiting, for example, in order to receive medical care, is hampered in the same way. The result, predictably, has been severe disruption of Palestinian lives and, according to UN reports, a decrease of more than 80% in the number of farmers who routinely cultivate their lands, and a decline of 60% in the total yield of olive orchards, among other harmful effects. The pretext for the wall was security, but that means security for illegal Jewish settlers. About 85% of the wall runs through the occupied West Bank. Israel is also taking over the Jordan Valley, thus fully imprisoning the cantons that remain. Huge infrastructure projects link settlers to Israel's urban centers, ensuring that they will see no Palestinians. Following a traditional neo-colonial model, a modern center remains for Palestinian elites in Ramallah, while the remainder of the population mostly languishes. To complete the separation of Greater Jerusalem from remaining Palestinian cantons, Israel would have to take over the E1 region. So far that action has been barred by Washington, and Israel has been compelled to resort to subterfuges, like building a police station there. Obama is the first U.S. president to have imposed no limits on Israeli actions. It remains to be seen whether he will permit Israel to take over E1, perhaps with expressions of discontent and a diplomatic wink to make it clear that these are not seriously intended. There are regular expulsions of Palestinians. In the Jordan Valley alone, the population has been reduced from 300,000 in 1967 to 60,000 today, and similar processes are underway elsewhere. 7 Following policies that go back a century. Each action is limited in scope so as not to arouse too much international attention, but they have a cumulative effect and intent that are quite clear. Furthermore, ever since the Oslo Accords declared that Gaza and the West Bank are an indivisible territorial unity, the U.S.-Israeli duo have been committed to separating the two regions. One significant effect is to ensure that any limited Palestinian entity will have no access to the outside world. In the areas that Israel is taking over, the Palestinian population is small and scattered and is being reduced further by regular expulsions. The result will be a greater Israel with a substantial Jewish majority. Under this third option, there will be no demographic problem and no civil rights or anti-apartheid struggle. Nothing more than what already exists within Israel's recognized borders, where the mantra Jewish and democratic is regularly intoned for the benefit of those who choose to believe, oblivious to the inherent contradiction, which is far more than merely symbolic. Unless achieved in stages, the one-state option will prove to be an illusion. It has no international support, and there is no reason why Israel and its U.S. sponsor would accept it. The question, often raised, of whether the hawkish Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would accept a Palestinian state, is misleading. In fact, his administration was the first to countenance this possibility when it came into office in 1996, following those of Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, which rejected it. Netanyahu's Director of Communications and Policy Planning, David Bar-Ilan, explained that some areas would be left to Palestinians, and if they wanted to call them a state, Israel would not object, or they could call them a fried chicken. His response reflects the operative attitude of the U.S.-Israeli coalition to Palestinian rights. The United States and Israel call for negotiations without preconditions. Commentary in both countries and elsewhere in the West typically claims that the Palestinians are imposing such preconditions, and so hampering the peace process. In reality, it is the United States and Israel that insist upon crucial preconditions. The first is that negotiations must be mediated by the United States, whereas any authentic negotiations would, of course, have to be in the hands of some neutral state with a degree of international respect. The second precondition is that illegal settlement expansion must be allowed to continue, as has happened without a break during the 20 years following the Oslo Accords. In the early years of the occupation, the United States joined the world in regarding the settlements as illegal, as confirmed by the UN Security Council and the International Court of Justice. Since the Reagan years, their status has been downgraded to a barrier to peace. Obama has weakened the designation further, to not helpful to peace. Obama's extreme rejectionism did arouse some attention in February 2011, when he vetoed a Security Council resolution supporting official U.S. policy, which calls for the ending of settlement expansion. As long as these preconditions remain in force, diplomacy is likely to remain at a standstill. With brief and rare exceptions, that has been true since January 1976. When the United States vetoed a Security Council resolution, brought by Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, calling for a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border, the Green Line, with guarantees for the security of all states within acknowledged and stable borders. That is essentially the international consensus that is by now universal, with the two usual exceptions. The consensus has been modified to include minor and mutual adjustments on the Green Line, to borrow official U.S. wording before it had broken with the rest of the world. The same is true of any negotiations that may take place in Washington or take place elsewhere overseen by Washington. Given these preconditions, little can be achieved other than letting Israel carry forward its project of taking over whatever it finds valuable in the West Bank and the Syrian Golan Heights, annexed in violation of Security Council orders, while maintaining the siege of Gaza. One can, of course, hope for better, but it is hard to be optimistic. Europe could play a role in advancing the world's aspirations for a peaceful diplomatic settlement, if it were willing to pursue an independent path. The European Union decision to exclude West Bank settlements from any future deals with Israel might be a step in this direction. U.S. policies are also not graven in stone, though they have deep strategic, economic, and cultural roots. In the absence of such changes, there is every reason to expect that the picture from the river to the sea will conform to the third option. Palestinian rights and aspirations will be shelved, temporarily at least. If the Israel-Palestine conflict is not resolved, a regional peace settlement is highly unlikely. That failure has far broader implications, in particular for what U.S. media call the gravest threat to world peace, Iran's nuclear programs. The implications become clearer when we look at the most obvious ways to deal with the alleged threat and their fate. It is useful, first, to consider a few preliminary questions. Who regards the threat as being of such cosmic significance? And what is the perceived threat? The Iran threat is overwhelmingly a Western obsession. The non-aligned countries, most of the world, have vigorously supported Iran's right, as a signer of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, to enrich uranium. In Western discourse, it is commonly claimed that the Arabs support the U.S. position regarding Iran, but the reference is to Arab dictators, not the general population. Also standard is reference to the standoff between the international community and Iran, to quote from the current scholarly literature. Here the phrase, international community, refers to the United States and whoever happens to go along with it, in this case, a small minority of the international community, but many more if political stands are weighted by power. What then is the perceived threat? An authoritative answer is given by U.S. intelligence and the Pentagon in their regular reviews of global security. They conclude that Iran is not a military threat. It has low military expenditures even by the standards of the region and limited capacity to deploy force. Its strategic doctrine is defensive, designed to resist attack. The intelligence community reports no evidence that Iran is developing nuclear weapons, but if it is, they conclude, that would be part of Iran's deterrent strategy. It is hard to think of a country in the world that needs a deterrent more than Iran. It has been tormented by the West without respite ever since its parliamentary regime was overthrown by a U.S.-British military coup in 1953, first under the harsh and brutal regime of the Shah, then under murderous attack by Saddam Hussein with Western support. It was largely U.S. intervention that induced Iran to capitulate in its war with Iraq, and shortly after, President George H.W. Bush invited Iraqi nuclear engineers to the United States for training in advanced weapons production, an extraordinary threat to Iran. 15. Iraq soon became an enemy of the United States, but meanwhile Iran was subjected to harsh sanctions, intensifying under U.S. initiative. It was also constantly subjected to the threat of military attack by the United States and Israel, in violation of the UN Charter, if anyone cares. It is, however, understandable that the United States and Israel would regard an Iranian deterrent as an intolerable threat. It would limit their ability to control the region, by violence if they choose, as they often have. That is the essence of the perceived Iranian threat. That the clerical regime is a threat to its own people is hardly in doubt, though regrettably it is hardly alone in that regard. But it goes well beyond naivete to believe that Iran's internal repression is much of a concern to the great powers. Whatever one thinks of the threat, are there ways to mitigate it? Quite a few, in fact. One of the most reasonable, as I have said elsewhere, would be to move toward establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Arab states and others call for immediate moves to eliminate weapons of mass destruction as a step toward regional security. The United States and Israel, in contrast, reverse the order, and demand regional security, meaning security for Israel, as a prerequisite to eliminating such weapons. In the not very remote background is the understanding that Israel, alone in the region, has an advanced nuclear weapons system and also refuses to join the NPT, along with India and Pakistan, both of whom similarly benefit from U.S. support for their nuclear arsenals. The connection of the Israel-Palestine conflict to the alleged Iranian threat is therefore clear. As long as the United States and Israel persist in their rejectionist stance, blocking the international consensus on a two-state settlement, there will be no regional security arrangements, hence no moves toward establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone and mitigating, perhaps even ending, what the United States and Israel claim to be the gravest threat to peace, at least to do so in the most obvious and far-reaching way. It should be noted that, along with Britain, the United States has a special responsibility to devote its efforts to establishing a Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone. When attempting to provide a thin legal cover for their invasion of Iraq in 2003, the two aggressors appealed to UN Security Council Resolution 687 of 1991, claiming that Saddam Hussein had violated the demand to end his nuclear weapons programs. The resolution also has another paragraph, calling for steps towards the goal of establishing in the Middle East a zone free from weapons of mass destruction, obligating the United States and United Kingdom even more than others to take this initiative seriously. These comments naturally leave out many urgent topics, among them the horrifying descent of Syria into suicide and ominous developments in Egypt, which are sure to have a regional impact. Nonetheless, this is how some of the core issues appear, to me at least. 12. Nothing for other people, class war in the United States. Norman Ware's classic study of the industrial worker appeared 90 years ago, the first of its kind. It has lost none of its significance. The lessons Ware draws from his close investigation of the impact of the emerging Industrial Revolution on the lives of working people, and on society in general, are just as pertinent today as when he wrote, if not more so, in the light of the striking parallels between the 1920s and today. It is important to remember the condition of working people when Ware wrote. The powerful and influential American labor movement that arose during the 19th century was being subjected to brutal attack, culminating in Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare after World War I. By the 1920s, the movement had largely been decimated. A classic study by the eminent labor historian David Montgomery is entitled The Fall of the House of Labor. The fall occurred in the 1920s. By the end of the decade, he writes, corporate mastery of American life seemed secure. Rationalization of business could then proceed with indispensable government support, with government largely in the hands of the corporate sector. It was far from a peaceful process. American labor history is unusually violent. One scholarly study concludes that the United States had more deaths at the end of the 19th century due to labor violence, in absolute terms and in proportion to population size, than any other country except Tsarist Russia. The term, labor violence, is a polite way of referring to violence by state and private security forces targeting working people. That continued into the late 1930s. I can remember such scenes from my childhood. As a result, Montgomery wrote, modern America had been created over its workers' protests, even though every step in its formation had been influenced by the activities, organizations, and proposals that had sprung from working-class life, not to speak of the hands and brains of those who did the work. The labor movement revived during the Great Depression, significantly influencing legislation and striking fear into the hearts of industrialists. In their publications, the industrialists warned of the hazard facing them from labor action backed by the newly realized political power of the masses. Though violent repression did not end, it was no longer adequate to the task. It was necessary to devise more subtle means to ensure corporate rule, primarily a flood of sophisticated propaganda and scientific methods of strike-breaking, developed into a high art by the enterprises that specialize in the task. We should not forget Adam Smith's perspicuous observation that the masters of mankind, in his day, the merchants and manufacturers of England, never ceased to pursue their vile maxim, all for ourselves, and nothing for other people. The business counterattack was put on hold during World War II, but quickly revived afterward, with harsh legislation passed restricting workers' rights and an extraordinary propaganda campaign aimed at factories, schools, churches, and every other form of association. Every available means of communication was employed. By the 1980s, with the bitterly anti-labor Reagan administration, the attack was again underway in full force. President Reagan made it clear to the business world that the laws protecting labor rights, never very strong, would not be enforced. The illegal firing of union organizers skyrocketed, and the United States returned to the use of scabs, outlawed almost everywhere in developed countries except South Africa. The liberal Clinton administration undermined labor in different ways. One highly effective means was the creation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, linking Canada, Mexico, and the United States. For propaganda purposes, NAFTA was labeled a free trade agreement. It was nothing of the sort. Like other such agreements, it had strong protectionist elements, and much of it was not about trade at all. It was an investors' rights agreement. And like other such free trade agreements, This one predictably proved harmful to working people in the participating countries. One effect was to undermine labor organizing. A study conducted under NAFTA auspices revealed that successful organizing declined sharply, thanks to such practices as management warnings that if an enterprise were unionized, it would be transferred to Mexico. Such practices are, of course, illegal, but that is irrelevant as long as business can count on the indispensable government support to which Montgomery referred. By such means, private sector unions were driven down to less than 7% of the workforce, despite the fact that most working people prefer unions. The attack then turned to public sector unions that had been somewhat protected by legislation. That unraveling is now fiercely underway, and not for the first time. We may recall that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968 while supporting a strike of public sector workers in Memphis, Tennessee. In many respects, the condition of working people when Ware wrote was similar to what we see today, as inequality has again reached the astonishing heights of the late 1920s. For a tiny minority, wealth has accumulated beyond the dreams of avarice. In the past decade, 95% of growth has gone into the pockets of 1% of the population, mostly a fraction of these. Median real income is below its level of 25 years ago. For males, median real income is below what it was in 1968. The labor share of output has fallen to its lowest level since World War II. This is not the result of the mysterious workings of the market or economic laws but, again, largely of the indispensable support and initiative of a government that is significantly in corporate hands. The American Industrial Revolution, Ware observed, created one of the major notes of American life in the 1840s and 1850s. While its ultimate outcome may be pleasing enough in modern eyes, it was repugnant to an astonishingly large section of the earlier American community. Ware reviews the hideous working conditions imposed on formerly independent craftsmen and farmers, as well as the factory girls, young women from the farms working in the textile mills around Boston. But his primary focus is on more fundamental features of the revolution that persisted even as specific conditions were ameliorated in the course of dedicated struggles over many years. Ware emphasized the degradation suffered by the industrial worker, the loss of status and independence that had been their most treasured possession as free citizens of the Republic, a loss that could not be compensated for even by material improvement. He explores the devastating impact of the radical capitalist, social revolution in which sovereignty in economic affairs passed from the community as a whole into the keeping of a special class of masters, a group alien to the producers and generally remote from production. He shows that, for every protest against machine industry, there can be found 100 against the new power of capitalist production and its discipline. Workers were striking not just for bread but for roses, to borrow the traditional labor slogan. They sought dignity and independence, recognition of their rights as free men and women. They created a lively and independent labor press, written and produced by those who toiled in the mills. In their journals they condemned the blasting influence of monarchical principles on democratic soil. They recognized that this assault on elementary human rights would not be overcome until they who work in the mills own them, and sovereignty returns to free producers. Then working people will no longer be menials or the humble subjects of a foreign despot, the absentee owners, slaves in the strictest sense of the word, who toil for their masters. Rather, they will regain their status as free American citizens. The capitalist revolution instituted a crucial change from price to wage. When the producer sold his product for a price, Ware writes, he retained his person. But when he came to sell his labor, he sold himself, and lost his dignity as a person as he became a slave, a wage slave, the term commonly used. Wage labor was considered similar to chattel slavery, though differing in that it was temporary, in theory. That understanding was so widespread that it became a slogan of the Republican Party, advocated by its leading figure, Abraham Lincoln. The concept that productive enterprises should be owned by the workforce was common coin in the mid-19th century, not just by Marx and the left, but also by the most prominent classical liberal figure of the day, John Stuart Mill. Mill held that the form of association, however, which if mankind continue to improve, must be expected to predominate is the association of the laborers themselves on terms of equality, collectively owning the capital with which they carry on their operations, and working under managers electable and removable by themselves. The concept indeed has solid roots in insights that animated classical liberal thought. It is a short step to link it to control of other institutions and of communities within a framework of free association and federal organization, in the general style of a range of thought that includes, along with much of the anarchist tradition and left anti-Bolshevik Marxism, also G. D. H. Cole's Guild Socialism and much more recent theoretical work. 15 And still more significantly, it includes actions as workers in many walks of life seek to gain control over their lives and fate. To undermine these subversive doctrines, it was necessary for the masters of mankind to try to change the attitudes and beliefs that foster them. As were reports, labor activists warned of the new spirit of the age, gain wealth, forgetting all but self, the vile maxim of the masters, which they naturally sought to impose on their subjects as well, knowing that they would be able to gain very little of the available wealth. In sharp reaction to this demeaning spirit, the rising movements of working people and radical farmers, the most significant democratic popular movements in American history, were dedicated to solidarity and mutual aid. They were defeated, mostly by force. But the battle is far from over, despite setbacks, often violent repression, and massive efforts to instill the vile maxim in the public mind, with the resources of educational systems, the huge advertising industry, and other propaganda institutions dedicated to the task.